The base auditorium always had an air of rigid formality. Its high ceilings echoed with the metallic clinks of boots on polished floors, the steady rhythm of military precision marking every entrance. Rows of soldiers filled the space, their uniforms crisp, their postures stiff, but beneath the surface ran a current of anticipation. The general's assemblies rarely meant anything routine. Whenever he called for the entire unit to gather, it carried weight. Rumors had been swirling since morning. Some whispered it was about new deployments. Others joked it would be another long lecture on discipline. Still, every man and woman had arrived, straight-backed, eyes forward, waiting. At the far back of the room sat Thomas Avery, unnoticed as usual. His uniform fit neatly, but it lacked the scars of wear that most combat soldiers' attire wore. He was a supply clerk, the kind of man whose world revolved around ledgers, requisition forms, and inventory tallies. While others tested their endurance in the mud of training fields or braced themselves under the weight of rifles, Thomas's battles were fought in silence, behind a desk with columns of numbers. He preferred it that way, not because he lacked respect for the frontline soldiers, quite the opposite, but because he knew his strengths lay elsewhere. Quiet, unassuming, Thomas blended into the background so thoroughly that some soldiers forgot his name. They called him the clerk, or paper pusher, never unkindly, but without the respect reserved for fighters. He didn't mind. He avoided competition, avoided spectacle, and certainly avoided conflict. His place was safe, steady. He didn't crave glory. But that morning, something in him stirred. The general's arrival was a spectacle in itself. General Marshall was a man of commanding presence, tall, broad-shouldered, his chest full of medals that clinked faintly with each step. His reputation was that of a leader who demanded absolute loyalty, not by fear, but by the respect he inspired. When he spoke, men listened, not because they were ordered to, but because his voice carried the weight of conviction. His eyes scanned the room like searchlights, locking briefly on individuals, leaving them straightening just a little taller. He strode to the front, silence falling instantly. "Soldiers," he began, his voice booming, "our strength is not measured by weapons alone. It is measured by courage, by the willingness to step forward when called." His gaze swept over the crowd, pausing dramatically. "So today, I ask for a volunteer." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. A volunteer for what? Heads turned, eyes darted, whispers formed, but quickly died under the general's gaze. He continued, "I want one among you to face Sergeant Cole in a challenge. A test of strength, discipline, and spirit." At the mention of Cole's name, a low murmur ran through the assembly. Everyone knew Sergeant Cole, the drill master, the iron hammer of the base. His reputation was legendary. Brutal training sessions that left even the toughest recruits gasping. His standards merciless, his punishments feared. Facing him wasn't an opportunity. It was a gauntlet no sane soldier would willingly take. The general paused, as though daring someone to rise. The silence stretched. Dozens of trained fighters sat rooted to their seats. Pride battled self-preservation. No one wanted to look cowardly, but no one was eager to be humiliated in front of their peers. A few soldiers glanced at one another nervously, some shifting in their seats, but none moved. At the back, Thomas felt a strange pull. His heart hammered in his chest. Why should he? He was no fighter, no rival to the sergeant. His place was with the books, the storerooms, the quiet corners no one noticed. But that voice in his mind, soft, insistent, whispered differently. It told him that sometimes the most important battles were not about winning, but about standing up when no one else would. His hand trembled, then steadied. And slowly, almost against his own expectation, Thomas rose to his feet. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The scrape of his chair against the floor echoed like thunder. Heads turned in disbelief. Whispers shot through the air. Soldiers craned their necks to see who had dared stand. When they saw it was the quiet clerk, gasps and muffled laughter broke out. "Thomas?" Someone muttered incredulously. "No way. Is he serious?" The general's eyes narrowed, curiosity flickering across his face. "You?" His tone held neither mockery nor encouragement, just surprise. Thomas swallowed, his voice steady, though quiet. "Yes, sir." Across the room, Sergeant Cole's grin spread wide. The expression wasn't one of kindness. It was a predator's smile, amused by the foolishness of its prey. His arms, thick with muscle, folded across his chest as he leaned back, chuckling low. "This'll be fun," he muttered, loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear. They snickered, expecting an easy spectacle. The laughter wasn't cruel, not entirely. Many of them respected Thomas in their own way. But the idea of him standing against Cole was absurd. This was a man who barely raised his voice, who spent more time with pens than rifles. Against the fiercest drill sergeant on base? It felt like setting a lamb before a lion. But Thomas didn't falter. His back was straight, his gaze level. For once, he didn't shrink under attention. He simply stood, steady as a post, as though rooted to the floor. The general studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Very well. You have your volunteer." A hush fell again, heavier this time. The weight of inevitability settled over the soldiers. Whatever happened next would not be forgotten. It would be told and retold in the barracks, in the mess halls, perhaps even beyond the base. And as Thomas sat back down, heart still pounding but face calm, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of certainty. He didn't know how he would fare against Cole, but he knew why he stood. For the first time in his quiet life, Thomas Avery had chosen to step into the spotlight, and the world around him would never look at him the same way again. Sergeant Cole's grin stretched slowly across his face, a grin that never promised humor. It was the grin of a man who had crushed recruits under his relentless training, who broke arrogance and apathy with equal ease. Everyone on base knew the look. It was the warning before he unleashed hell. He stood with an easy swagger, his broad chest filling out his fatigues, the thick cords of his arms flexing, as if he couldn't help but remind everyone how much power he carried. "Are you sure about this, son?" the general asked, turning his gaze back to Thomas. The words carried no malice, only gravity. He was offering the clerk an escape, an honorable way to step back before the challenge began. Thomas only nodded once, calm, almost serene. The murmurs grew louder. Some soldiers leaned forward in their seats, whispering their bets. "No way he lasts a minute." Others chuckled under their breath, already predicting how quickly Cole would flatten him. A few frowned, uneasy with the thought of watching a lamb walk willingly into the lion's den. Cole chuckled, his deep voice rolling like thunder. "Well, this is a first. A supply clerk wants to dance." He slapped one hand against the other, a sound like the crack of a whip, and added, "Hope you're ready to sweat." Oi! It wasn't just physical intimidation that made Cole feared. It was his mind. He knew how to break men without laying a hand on them, how to get under their skin, to make them doubt themselves until they crumbled. More than one soldier had left his training sessions with eyes hollowed, confidence shattered. Facing Cole wasn't about strength, it was about survival. Thomas, however, showed no outward reaction. He adjusted his glasses, the movement small, almost delicate, and straightened his posture. His silence unsettled some of the onlookers. "Maybe he's crazy," one private muttered. "Or maybe he knows something we don't," another replied, though his tone was doubtful. The general raised a hand for quiet, and instantly the room obeyed. "Very well. The challenge will proceed." Sergeant Cole, you may test the volunteer as you see fit within reason. His eyes lingered on Cole with that last phrase, a subtle warning to keep the trial fair, though the smirk on Cole's face suggested he intended to make it brutal regardless. Thomas's mind was steady, but not without turbulence. Beneath his calm exterior, memories flickered. His father's funeral, the weight of words left unsaid, the nights he'd trained alone in his youth, not for glory, but for balance, for focus. He had buried those skills in the quiet life of paperwork, never seeking to prove himself, never needing to. Until now. He drew a slow breath. The first test would be physical, that much was obvious. Cole didn't believe in starting small. He wanted to humiliate quickly, decisively, so that the clerk would regret ever daring to rise. But humiliation wasn't what Thomas feared. What he feared was failing to stand, failing to prove that quiet strength mattered. Cole clapped his hands once. Push-ups. As many as you can handle. Let's see what the little pen pusher's got. His tone was dripping with mockery. He dropped to the floor with the force of a sledgehammer, his palms slamming against the polished wood as he extended himself in a perfect plank. His muscles bunched and flexed like ropes, veins standing out as he began the first repetition. Thomas lowered himself beside him, quieter, smoother, his form neat though less dramatic. 1, the sergeant barked, his voice filling the hall. The soldiers began to count with him, the rhythm steady. 10 passed quickly, then 20. Cole's movements were sharp, almost violent, his body slamming down and pushing back up with raw aggression. Thomas moved differently, measured, controlled, his breathing steady, almost meditative. By 40, sweat rolled off Cole's brow, though he remained fierce, determined to dominate. Thomas, however, looked unchanged, as if his body had fallen into a rhythm older than the challenge itself. By 50, the murmurs began again. Some soldiers leaned forward, eyes widening. He's keeping up. At 70, the energy shifted. Cole's smirk faded, replaced by a clenched jaw, the muscles in his arms trembling slightly. Thomas's face remained calm, his glasses slipping down his nose, which he pushed back with the barest flick of a finger before continuing without pause. By 80, the soldiers were cheering not for Cole, but for Thomas. The tide of support shifted like a storm, voices rising with disbelief and excitement. Cole growled through his repetitions, sweat dripping onto the floor. At 90, his arms gave way, his chest hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Gasps echoed through the room. He had never been beaten at push-ups, not by recruits, not by fellow sergeants. And then Thomas, with unhurried grace, pressed out one final repetition, completing 91. He rose to his feet in silence, standing tall, his breathing steady. The auditorium erupted. The general's eyes widened slightly, though his expression quickly shifted into something deeper respect. He leaned forward, studying the clerk as though seeing him for the first time. This was no fluke. This man had reserves of discipline no one had suspected. Cole, red-faced and breathing hard, pushed himself upright. His pride bristled, fury simmering beneath his skin, but even he couldn't deny what had just happened. His glare locked on Thomas, and for the first time, there was no humor in it. Only determination. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. The soldiers roared with anticipation. They hadn't expected a show that day, but now they were witnessing a battle of wills unlike any other. The quiet clerk had stepped out of the shadows, and with one simple contest, had shifted the balance of the entire room. Thomas adjusted his glasses again, offering no words, no boast. His silence was louder than any cheer, and in that silence lay the promise that this was only the beginning. The air in the auditorium felt heavier after the push-up contest, thick with the energy of disbelief. Soldiers who had laughed at the idea of Thomas competing now leaned forward in their seats, whispering furiously. What had just happened didn't make sense. Sergeant Cole, the man who pushed even the fittest recruits beyond breaking, had been outlasted by a clerk. A clerk who, until today, had been invisible. Cole wiped the sweat from his forehead, his jaw locked tight. He wasn't accustomed to losing, and certainly not in front of an audience. His entire career had been built on dominance, on proving again and again that no one could match his endurance or his willpower. To be bested by Thomas Avery of all people felt like a humiliation that scraped against his very identity. The general remained silent, his hands clasped behind his back, but his eyes betrayed amusement. He had not expected this turn of events either, but he was intrigued. What had driven the quietest man on base to stand up, and how far could he go? Cole straightened, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "That was just warm-up," he growled. His voice reverberated in the walls, carrying a sharp edge that silenced the crowd's murmurs. He jabbed a finger toward the doors. Obstacle course. Now. A wave of excitement swept the soldiers. If push-ups had been a test of grit, the obstacle course was a crucible of total soldiering strength, agility, speed, balance, and sheer will. This was Cole's domain. He had designed the course himself, tailoring it to break bodies and spirits alike. It was his signature, his pride. No one completed it unscathed. The crowd surged out of the auditorium, boots clattering on concrete as they poured into the yard where the obstacle course stretched like a battlefield frozen in wood, rope, and steel. The course loomed. High walls, crawling trenches, dangling ropes, monkey bars slick with morning dew, and the infamous mud pit at its center. At the far end stood the towering 15-foot wall, the final challenge that had left countless recruits slumped in defeat. Cole stripped off his fatigue jacket, revealing muscles hard as stone, his arms etched with scars from years of relentless training. He cracked his neck and rolled his shoulders, prowling like a predator ready to reclaim his throne. His eyes never left Thomas. Thomas stepped forward quietly, still calm, still measured. His uniform was simple, sleeves rolled neatly, his glasses perched securely. He didn't radiate ferocity like Cole, nor did he exude arrogance. He carried only an aura of focus, as though every step was part of a deliberate rhythm. "Ready to embarrass yourself, Clerk?" Cole sneered, his voice carrying across the field. The crowd chuckled nervously. Some still couldn't believe Thomas had volunteered. Others now wondered if perhaps they had underestimated him all along. Thomas didn't respond. He simply nodded once. The whistle blew. Cole exploded off the starting line with the force of a cannonball. His boots pounded the earth, muscles propelling him forward with terrifying speed. He hit the first wall and vaulted it in one powerful leap, his hands gripping the top like iron hooks before swinging his legs over. The crowd roared. This was the Cole they knew, unstoppable, fierce, relentless. Thomas began slower, but his pace was steady, his movements precise. He reached the wall and didn't leap recklessly. Instead, he used his momentum and balance, planting a foot halfway up before pushing upward and catching the top with controlled grace. His climb was smooth, efficient, and he dropped lightly on the other side. Cole had already reached the crawling trench, diving headfirst into the mud, his powerful arms pulling him forward in bursts of speed. Dirt smeared his face, but he drove onward with bulldog determination. Thomas slid into the trench moments later, his smaller frame working to his advantage. He moved like water, flowing low, conserving energy where Cole spent it recklessly. By the time Cole surged out of the trench, Thomas had nearly halved the distance between them. Next came the rope climb. Cole leapt upward, gripping the thick cord, hauling himself hand over hand with raw power. His biceps bulged as he fought gravity, snarling with effort. He slapped the top beam, and dropped back down with a grunt of triumph. Thomas arrived seconds later. He didn't leap, he studied the rope, then sprang upward with calculated precision, catching higher than expected. His hands moved fluidly, his legs braced around the rope to reduce strain. His ascent wasn't faster than Cole's, but it was smoother, less wasteful. He touched the top, slid back down, and landed with balance intact. The soldiers began to notice. Cole's aggression was impressive, but Thomas's methodical rhythm was closing the gap. The monkey bars came next. Cole hurled himself across, each swing violent, his body straining. Halfway through, his grip slipped, and for a brief moment, he dangled, teeth bared, before recovering and finishing with a snarl. Thomas reached the bars and approached them differently. He swung like a pendulum, each motion deliberate, his momentum carrying him forward. He didn't waste energy in wild swings. He moved gracefully, almost elegantly, until his feet touched the ground again. The crowd erupted. Shouts of "Go, Thomas!" mingled with cheers for Cole. The atmosphere had transformed into a spectacle, half sporting event, half battlefield. Cole sprinted into the mud pit, charging through it like a bull, each step spraying sludge in every direction. He powered forward, but the mud dragged at him, clinging, resisting. By the time he slogged out, his speed had faltered. Thomas entered the pit with measured strides. He didn't fight the mud. He moved with it, lifting his legs higher, finding balance in each step. While Cole's strength battled the mire, Thomas's patience allowed him to glide more efficiently. He emerged only a few paces behind. Now the final wall loomed. 15 feet of solid wood, towering like a fortress. For years, this wall had been Cole's ultimate symbol of dominance. He sprinted, leapt, and slammed against it, his arms straining as he clawed upward. His body shook with effort, but he pulled, heaved, and finally threw himself over the top, rolling down the far side. The crowd roared approval. Cole was victorious, or so it seemed. But Thomas didn't stop running. He reached the wall, studied it in a fraction of a second, and adjusted his stride. Instead of brute force, he used momentum. He sprinted hard, planted a foot against the wall, then another higher up, and launched himself upward with surprising grace. His hand caught the top beam on the first try. He pulled himself over with controlled strength, swung one leg up, and vaulted cleanly to the other side. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the crowd. Then an explosion of cheers erupted, louder than ever. Thomas had cleared the wall faster. The whistle blew. The soldiers lost all composure, shouting, clapping, even stamping their boots. Some stared in disbelief, others grinned with newfound admiration. Cole, panting hard, wiped mud from his face, his pride wounded deeper than the sweat dripping from his body. The general's expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Thomas. In that quiet clerk, he saw not luck, not chance, but something rare. Discipline, patience, and the kind of courage that revealed itself only when tested. Thomas said nothing. He didn't raise his fists, didn't shout in triumph. He simply stood, breathing evenly, his glasses streaked with mud, his gaze steady. And in that moment, the soldiers understood. The challenge was no longer about whether Thomas could survive. It was about how far he could go. The yard seemed to hold its breath. Mud still dripping from their clothes, soldiers gathered around the course's far edge, forming a tight circle around the two men. Cole's chest heaved. His arms, once pillars of unstoppable force, trembled slightly from the obstacle course. His face, smeared with mud and sweat, was a mask of fury and disbelief. He had expected to humiliate the clerk easily, to prove once and for all that Thomas Avery belonged behind a desk, not facing soldiers. Instead, he had been bested at every stage, and now the final challenge awaited, hand-to-hand combat. Cole's grin had returned, though it was different this time. A predator's smile, sharp and dangerous, edged with the promise of retribution. "All right, Clerk," he barked, his voice cutting through the cheering crowd. "Let's see what you've really got." "Stand ready." Thomas adjusted his glasses and nodded. He didn't shout, didn't try to intimidate. He only breathed, measured and calm, centering himself. Years ago, he had studied martial arts, not for sport, not for glory, but to learn discipline, control, and focus. His instructors had taught him that strength alone was meaningless without balance and timing. Every movement had a purpose. Every strike had intent. The soldiers circled tighter, murmuring, their excitement reaching a fever pitch. Some could hardly believe what they were about to witness. Cole had faced the strongest men on base and crushed them. Could this quiet clerk possibly survive or triumph? The whistle blew. Cole lunged first, a forceful charge meant to overpower. His fists swung with raw aggression, every movement fueled by anger and muscle memory honed over years. But Thomas didn't flinch. He shifted subtly, moving with Cole's momentum rather than against it, redirecting the force. One punch glanced off harmlessly as Thomas sidestepped, maintaining balance, his feet grounded, his hands ready to counter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. They had never seen the clerk move like this. Not fluid, not frantic, but precise, deliberate, controlled. Cole's first surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced with determination. He wasn't used to opponents who could evade him without fear, who absorbed his force and turned it back. Cole adjusted his strategy, feinting left, then striking right. Thomas anticipated the pattern. He shifted again, blocked with minimal effort, and countered with a controlled push to Cole's chest, enough to unbalance him slightly, but not harm him. The crowd murmured in astonishment. Every move Thomas made seemed effortless, almost elegant, yet devastating in its effectiveness. Cole's muscles tensed, his breathing growing heavier. He had underestimated this man. Strength alone was no longer enough. He had to adapt, think, anticipate. And yet, for every move Cole made, Thomas seemed to have an answer. A step, a turn, a redirection that left him on the edge of dominance. The fight became a rhythm, a tense dance of power versus precision. Cole swung, Thomas parried. Cole lunged, Thomas sidestepped. The two men moved across the yard, their every action watched by dozens of soldiers who shouted encouragement, disbelief, and amazement in equal measure. Thomas's small frame made him look almost fragile, but each calculated strike and block revealed hidden reserves of strength, honed over years of disciplined practice. Cole's pride burned hotter with every moment. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to end it quickly, to humiliate the clerk and reassert his dominance. Instead, Thomas stood toe-to-toe with him, unshaken, almost serene. It was maddening. The general, standing at the edge of the yard, observed quietly. He had seen many soldiers excel through brute force, but Thomas demonstrated something rarer, mastery of self. Cole had power, yes, but Thomas had control. And in this arena, control often outweighed raw strength. Cole swung a wide hook, aiming to catch Thomas off guard. Thomas shifted, letting the fist pass by harmlessly, then applied a gentle but precise push to Cole's side, sending him stumbling backward slightly. It wasn't enough to knock him down entirely, but it demonstrated clearly that Cole's brute force was no longer absolute. The soldiers gasped and cheered. "He's doing it! He's actually doing it!" Cole snarled, recovering quickly. His pride demanded victory, his instinct demanded force. He charged again, faster, sharper, more unpredictable. Thomas met him with calm precision, his own movements subtle yet effective. Every punch, every parry, every adjustment was calculated, designed to conserve energy and redirect aggression rather than meet it head-on. Time seemed to stretch. Sweat and mud coated both men, yet neither slowed. The crowd's excitement grew unbearable, soldiers shouting, stomping, cheering, caught in the spectacle of the impossible. Thomas's quiet strength was mesmerizing, Cole's raw power intoxicating. The contrast between them created a tension that held everyone on the edge of their seats. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Cole aimed a powerful uppercut, intending to end the duel. Thomas anticipated it, shifted his stance, and used Cole's momentum to pivot him off balance. Cole's boots skidded against the mud, his arms flailing for purchase. In one smooth motion, Thomas guided the sergeant to the ground, not cruelly, not violently, but decisively. Cole landed with a heavy thud, mud splashing around him, momentarily stunned. Silence hung for a heartbeat. Then the crowd erupted. The sound was deafening, a mixture of cheers, laughter, and disbelief. Thomas stood, breathing evenly, not gloating, not celebrating. He extended a hand to Cole. Cole stared, mud and sweat streaking his face, pride wounded but slowly recovering. He looked up at Thomas, then at the cheering soldiers, and finally took the offered hand. The gesture was small, but it carried weight, a quiet acknowledgement that he had been bested fairly, honorably, and by a man whose strength was more than muscle. The general stepped forward, clapping slowly, deliberately. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but filled with gravity, "today you have witnessed more than skill. You have witnessed courage, discipline, and the power of quiet determination. Sergeant Cole is a formidable opponent. Thomas Avery has shown us all that strength comes in many forms." Thomas finally allowed himself a small, humble smile. He had proven something, not just to the soldiers around him, not just to Cole, but to himself. That quiet clerk, unnoticed for so long, had emerged into the light, demonstrating that courage and preparation could rival even the most imposing force. The soldiers swarmed around them, clapping Thomas on the back, offering congratulations, shaking his hand, some even raising him on their shoulders in celebration. Cole, mud-streaked and breathing hard, finally allowed a grudging smile. He had been defeated, yes, but he had also seen something rare. A disciplined, quiet strength that could stand against fury and force. In the days that followed, the story spread across the base. Every soldier repeated it in mess halls, barracks, and training fields. The story of the quiet clerk who stunned everyone by defeating the unbreakable drill sergeant. And while Thomas returned to his duties in the supply office, unchanged in demeanor, everything around him had shifted. Respect, acknowledgement, and the quiet reverence of those who had once overlooked him now followed wherever he went. He had not sought glory, but in standing firm, he had earned it. Cole continued his duties as sergeant, his pride tempered by respect. He never underestimated another soldier again, not one, and certainly not Thomas Avery. And the yard, once just a field of drills and mud, had become the stage for a lesson that no one would forget. The quietest voices often carry the strongest echoes. The yard gradually emptied as the adrenaline of the challenge faded, leaving behind a thick, damp residue of mud and sweat. Soldiers trudged back to the barracks, some still talking animatedly about the clerk who had outmatched Sergeant Cole, their voices carrying a mix of disbelief, admiration, and excitement. Others lingered a moment longer, throwing glances at Thomas, almost afraid to break the spell of the spectacle they had just witnessed. Thomas, meanwhile, had moved quietly through the commotion. He brushed the mud from his sleeves and straightened his uniform. His glasses, streaked with sweat and smudges, reflected the sun in sharp glints. Unlike the roaring crowd, he felt neither elation nor triumph. In his mind, this was simply another test, a measure of readiness, discipline, and focus. He had faced Cole, yes, but the real challenge was internal. Staying calm, executing his training, and trusting himself under pressure. As he returned to the supply office, the familiar scent of ink, paper, and polished wood greeted him like an old friend. The ledger-filled shelves, orderly stacks of forms, and neatly arranged equipment seemed mundane after the chaos of the day, yet there was comfort in their predictability. He sat at his desk, fingers brushing the surface gently, the rhythm of everyday work grounding him after the extraordinary spectacle. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect on what had just transpired. Every drill, every quiet hour of training, every solitary lesson in martial arts had prepared him for this. None of it had been visible to anyone else. No one had noticed the years he had spent honing balance, control, and endurance. Today, all of that hidden preparation had surfaced in a way no one expected. He had not acted to prove anyone wrong, but the result was undeniable. Respect and recognition now accompanied him wherever he went. The door creaked open, and one of the junior clerks peeked inside hesitantly. Thomas?" he stammered. "The others. They want to see you? Some of the soldiers from the yard. They want to," he trailed off, embarrassed. Thomas looked up, expression calm. "I'll see them," he said softly. Within minutes, a trickle of soldiers entered the office, some smiling awkwardly, others clearly exhilarated. They carried with them the energy of victory and excitement, yet they approached with a mixture of awe and caution. For weeks, they had overlooked him. Today, they were discovering something new. "Thomas," one of the younger soldiers said, voice almost shaking. We didn't know you could do that." "I mean, Cole." "Nobody beats Cole," Thomas nodded slightly, giving a measured, gentle smile. "I wasn't trying to beat him. I was trying to stay focused. That's all." Another soldier, braver than the rest, stepped forward. "It's not just that. You made it look effortless, calm, like you weren't even trying." Thomas considered this, pushing back his glasses. Years of practice make things seem effortless. It doesn't mean it's easy. There was a pause as the soldiers absorbed his words. Then, one by one, they began to nod, their admiration deepening. This wasn't just about strength or speed. It was about discipline, poise, and quiet confidence. Word of Thomas's victory spread quickly through the base. Mess halls, barracks, and training grounds buzzed with discussion. Soldiers who had once ignored him now sought his counsel on physical training, strategy, and even leadership. Some approached him timidly, asking questions about how he had prepared, how he had stayed calm under pressure, and how he had anticipated Cole's every move. Others merely watched, silent, absorbing the lessons of focus and patience. Yet Thomas remained grounded. He answered questions without boastfulness, demonstrating humility that only heightened his respect among his peers. He spoke not of glory or victory, but of preparation, discipline, and trust in oneself. In doing so, he transformed the perception of what it meant to be strong, showing that courage and resilience could be quiet yet profoundly impactful. Even Sergeant Cole's behavior shifted subtly. He still trained fiercely, still commanded with authority, but his interactions with Thomas now carried a grudging respect. He would no longer underestimate anyone, and he would never again treat a quiet presence as inconsequential. Cole's acknowledgement was unspoken yet powerful, a silent lesson to the entire base that strength came in many forms. Back in the office, Thomas resumed his duties, yet everything had changed. His ledger entries, forms, and inventory checks seemed mundane, but there was a new energy in the room, a subtle shift in the base's dynamics. Where once he had been invisible, now he was a symbol of discipline and resilience. Soldiers passed by, offering nods of respect or quiet smiles. Even minor interactions carried significance. Despite the external recognition, Thomas's focus remained inward. He reflected on the lessons of the day, not just about physical capability, but about mental and emotional fortitude. True courage, he realized, was not about performing in front of an audience or overpowering opponents. It was about preparation, balance, and the quiet confidence to act decisively when it mattered most. The base itself seemed to hum with a renewed sense of possibility. Soldiers who had doubted themselves or others began to reconsider their assumptions. The victory of the quiet clerk became a story that transcended mere competition. It became a lesson in discipline, patience, and courage that others sought to emulate. Training regimens, once rigid and monotonous, began to shift subtly as instructors emphasized strategy and control alongside raw power. Thomas's example had created a ripple effect, reshaping the culture of the base in ways no one could have predicted. As evening approached, Thomas walked through the base quietly, observing the soldiers going about their routines. He saw young recruits training harder, veterans discussing tactics with renewed focus, and even Cole patrolling with a tempered intensity that reflected the lessons of humility and respect. All of this unfolded without fanfare or ceremony, yet its impact was profound. The day's events would echo for years in stories, anecdotes, and informal teachings, shaping the perception of courage and leadership in subtle but lasting ways. By the time he returned to his small office, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base. He glanced around at the orderly stacks of paper, the neatly labeled supplies, and the quiet hum of clerical work. Everything seemed unchanged outwardly, yet he knew better. Today had proven that even the quietest individuals could have an extraordinary impact. Today had proven that respect, discipline, and courage were not always loud, they were sometimes hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Thomas sat down at his desk, opened a ledger, and picked up his pen. The familiar rhythm of work brought him comfort. But now, in the background of ordinary duty, he carried the invisible weight of lessons learned, victories earned, and respect gained. Outside, the base continued its evening routines, soldiers laughing, training, and moving with renewed purpose. All of it had been touched by his quiet triumph. In that moment, Thomas Avery understood a truth deeper than victory. Greatness does not always demand recognition, but when it reveals itself, it has the power to inspire, transform, and endure. And though he would continue to work quietly behind his desk, the echoes of his courage would resound throughout the base for years to come, a quiet legend growing steadily with every retelling. The following morning, the base seemed different. Not in obvious ways buildings were the same. Flags still snapped in the wind, but in subtle, unmistakable ways. Soldiers carried themselves differently. There was a quiet confidence in their stride, a hint of curiosity in their interactions. They spoke with more care, watched more closely, and most importantly, began to see potential in places they had previously ignored. Thomas Avery arrived at the supply office as usual, carrying his briefcase and a neatly stacked bundle of requisition forms. On his way, he noticed small gestures he had not seen before, soldiers holding doors for one another, offering advice, or quietly acknowledging someone's effort with a nod. Many glanced toward him, not with mockery or indifference, but with respect, a respect earned, unspoken, yet palpable. Inside the office, Thomas began organizing the day's work, but the rhythm was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young recruit, barely out of basic training, stepped inside, hesitating. His uniform was clean, but his eyes betrayed nervousness. "Sir, Thomas?" he stammered. I just wanted to ask. How did you? I've never seen anyone, even Cole, beaten like that." Thomas looked up, adjusting his glasses. His expression was calm, patient. "It's not about beating anyone," he said softly. "It's about preparation, focus, and understanding your limits. Discipline isn't just about strength. It's about knowing yourself and trusting your training." The recruit's eyes widened, absorbing the words. "So, it's not luck?" Thomas shook his head gently. "No, it's deliberate. Every choice, every action, every step matters. That's how you succeed when the stakes are high." Word of Thomas's victory and the lessons behind it spread quickly. Soldiers began seeking his advice on training techniques, mental preparation, and even strategy for drills. He remained humble, answering questions carefully, never boasting, always emphasizing that success depended on discipline, focus, and consistency. His office became a quiet hub of mentorship, a place where anyone willing to learn could approach him without fear or intimidation. Even Sergeant Cole's demeanor had shifted subtly. Though he still maintained authority and rigor, there was now an undercurrent of respect when Thomas passed. On training grounds, Cole would sometimes offer advice to those attempting maneuvers, referencing Thomas's approach without naming him. The acknowledgement was indirect, quiet, but meaningful, a veteran conceding that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. Outside the office, the ripple effect was visible. Recruits pushed harder, veterans observed more thoughtfully, and training routines began to incorporate techniques emphasizing balance, rhythm, and strategy. Strength alone was no longer the only measure of capability. Soldiers began to understand that Thomas Avery, the quiet clerk, had changed the way they thought about skill and courage. One afternoon, Thomas walked through the training yard, observing a group attempting a climbing drill. He noticed a young soldier struggling with timing and momentum. Without a word, he approached and gently demonstrated a subtle adjustment in foot placement and body posture. The soldier followed, and suddenly the climb became manageable. A smile spread across the recruit's face, pride and relief shining brightly. Other soldiers nearby whispered, watching quietly, inspired by the example. Later, Thomas returned to his ledger-filled office, reflecting on the shift he had observed. It was subtle but profound. Respect was no longer assumed, it was earned. Recognition came not from intimidation, but from consistency, patience, and quiet strength. For years, he had worked unnoticed, content with his contributions behind a desk. Now, his influence extended far beyond paperwork and supply requests. He had become a symbol, a reminder that courage and wisdom often reside in unexpected places. The general visited the supply office later that week, quietly observing Thomas as he worked. He did not speak immediately, letting Thomas move through his routine with ease. When he finally addressed him, his voice carried the weight of authority, tempered by admiration. "You've changed the base, Thomas," the general said, looking around. "Not through orders or force, but through example. People are thinking differently now. They see what's possible. You've taught them more than I could with a speech." Thomas looked up, expression calm, thoughtful. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "I just trusted my preparation and stayed focused. If that inspires others, I'm glad. But it's not about me. It's about what we can all achieve when we approach challenges." Deliberately, the general nodded slowly. Sometimes, the quietest voices carry the strongest lessons. Over the next weeks, Thomas continued to work diligently, balancing his clerical duties with informal mentorship. Soldiers from all ranks approached him, asking for guidance in both physical and mental preparation. He emphasized incremental progress, patience, and observation. He taught recruits to anticipate challenges, to read opponents, to remain calm under pressure. Each lesson reinforced not only skill, but self-confidence. One afternoon, Thomas noticed a subtle shift in Sergeant Cole during a training session. Instead of demonstrating sheer power, Cole began showing recruits how to adjust technique, conserve energy, and think ahead. Thomas realized then that the impact of his victory was extending even to the most seasoned soldiers. Change, he understood, did not always happen immediately. It often began quietly, in small gestures, until it reshaped the culture entirely. That evening, Thomas walked alone through the base, observing soldiers settling into their evening routines. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the field, and the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and training mats. He reflected on how far the base had come, not because of a single spectacle, but because of the ripples created by focus, discipline, and calm determination. He thought about the young recruit who had asked him questions days earlier. He thought about the veterans who now approached him quietly, seeking insight. He thought about Sergeant Cole, still commanding, still formidable, yet tempered with humility and newfound awareness. Each reflection reinforced a profound truth. The strongest leadership was not loud or flashy, but consistent, deliberate, and rooted in integrity. As night fell, the base settled into a quieter rhythm. Lamps cast warm pools of light over the barracks, and soldiers rested after a long day of training. Thomas returned to his office one last time, organizing papers and updating inventory logs. The room smelled of ink and polished wood, familiar and comforting. It was the same room he had occupied for years, yet it now held a different energy. It had witnessed the unfolding of courage, influence, and subtle transformation. Thomas sat at his desk, pen in hand, contemplating the lessons of the past weeks. Victory had not been about arrogance or dominance. It had been about trust in preparation, steadiness under pressure, and the quiet power of disciplined effort. Respect, he realized, was earned not by spectacle, but by consistency, integrity, and humility. And though he would continue his work quietly behind a desk, the echoes of his actions would ripple across the base, influencing countless soldiers in ways both subtle and profound. By the time he finally left the office, the stars had begun to appear, casting a serene glow over the base. Thomas walked slowly, observing the world around him, recognizing the shifts his actions had inspired. In silence, he felt a sense of fulfillment not from recognition, but from knowing that courage, when wielded thoughtfully, could inspire, transform, and endure. And as he disappeared into the shadows of the quiet base, one thing was certain. Thomas Avery had left a mark far greater than any single contest. His influence, subtle yet profound, would continue to shape the lives and attitudes of soldiers for years to come, a testament to the enduring power of discipline, humility, and quiet courage. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of Thomas Avery's victory over Sergeant Cole continued to grow across the base. What had begun as a single, improbable event became a lesson ingrained in daily life. Soldiers who once measured strength purely in muscle now spoke in terms of patience, discipline, and strategic thinking. Recruits who had previously doubted themselves approached challenges with a newfound sense of possibility. Thomas had become more than a clerk. He was a living example that quiet determination could reshape expectations. The supply office remained his domain, a sanctuary of order and consistency. Yet it had transformed subtly, becoming a hub for mentorship. Soldiers entered not just for logistical support, but for guidance, seeking insight into how one could prepare for challenges both visible and hidden. Thomas greeted them with calm attentiveness, answering questions with care, offering small adjustments in technique, mental exercises, and practical advice. His approach was never authoritarian. He listened first, then offered solutions, ensuring each soldier felt empowered rather than instructed. Sergeant Cole had adapted as well. While he continued to enforce rigorous training, he began to integrate Thomas's philosophy subtly into his own methods. He demonstrated to recruits how to pace themselves, anticipate obstacles, and use strategy rather than relying solely on brute strength. The sergeant still commanded respect, but now it was coupled with a quiet acknowledgement of Thomas's influence. Their relationship was unspoken, but profound, a mutual recognition of skill, discipline, and integrity that transcended rivalry. On the training field, Thomas observed exercises with an analytical eye. Recruits moved through drills with improved focus, paying attention to rhythm, technique, and body mechanics. Soldiers who once rushed blindly through obstacle courses now studied the terrain, adjusted their approach, and conserved energy. He rarely intervened directly, preferring to let observation guide learning. When a correction was necessary, it was subtle, a shift of a foot, a repositioning of a hand, a soft verbal cue. The impact, however, was profound. Small adjustments led to significant improvement, and soldiers began to internalize lessons without needing explicit instruction. The mess hall buzzed with stories of Thomas's exploits, though he never encouraged them. Recruits spoke of the clerk who had bested Cole, demonstrating courage, precision, and strategy. Veterans shared anecdotes of his mentorship, highlighting his calm presence and careful guidance. Even those who had once dismissed him now sought his perspective on both training and leadership. He became a symbol not through boastfulness or ceremony, but through consistent demonstration of skill, restraint, and quiet confidence. One evening, Thomas walked through the training yard alone, observing a small group practicing defensive maneuvers. He noticed a young recruit struggling with timing and coordination. Rather than stepping in immediately, Thomas allowed the soldier to continue, watching closely. Moments later, the recruit stumbled and nearly fell. Thomas approached gently, demonstrating a small shift in stance and movement. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet the result was immediate. The soldier moved with greater stability and confidence. Nearby, other soldiers observed silently, taking note of the lesson. The murmurs of admiration were quiet, but genuine. They began to see that leadership was not always about loud commands or displays of strength. Sometimes it was about observation, timing, and subtle guidance. Thomas Avery, the quiet clerk, had become an unwitting teacher. Over time, Thomas's influence extended beyond individual mentorship. Training routines were subtly revised to incorporate balance, rhythm, and strategic thinking. Recruits were encouraged to study opponents, anticipate challenges, and apply mental discipline alongside physical skill. The culture of the base shifted, growing more nuanced and thoughtful. Strength alone was no longer the sole measure of capability. Wisdom, composure, and preparation were now recognized as equally vital. Even during administrative duties, Thomas's presence was impactful. Soldiers who approached for logistical support were met not with brusque efficiency, but with measured attention. He taught them patience, careful planning, and the value of foresight. Small habits, reinforced daily, began to influence larger outcomes. Supplies were organized with precision, requests processed systematically, and errors minimized. His example demonstrated that excellence in any role, whether on the battlefield or behind a desk, required focus, diligence, and quiet resolve. The general, too, observed the changes with growing admiration. During inspections, he noted the subtle improvements in both training outcomes and soldier morale. Recruits moved more confidently. Veterans demonstrated leadership without arrogance, and discipline was applied with thoughtful intention. The clerk who had once seemed invisible had become an essential, stabilizing presence. The general often repeated the story of Thomas Avery in speeches, emphasizing that courage, preparation, and quiet determination could influence not just individuals, but an entire institution. Thomas himself remained unchanged outwardly. He continued to perform his duties with the same diligence, never seeking praise or recognition. He rarely spoke of his victories, preferring to let actions speak for themselves. Yet the base had been irrevocably altered. Respect followed him quietly. Soldiers emulated his focus, and leadership, once tied to loud authority, now included the power of observation, patience, and disciplined execution. Even Sergeant Cole, who had once relied on sheer force and intimidation, acknowledged this shift. During drills, he would point to subtle techniques, demonstrate control, and emphasize strategy, often referencing Thomas's approach without naming him. Their mutual understanding created a new balance on the base strength tempered by wisdom, authority balanced with respect. The relationship, unspoken yet powerful, served as a model for all soldiers. One day, Thomas walked past the barracks and noticed a group of recruits practicing together. They were discussing strategies for a mock drill, imitating movements he had subtly taught them through observation. He paused, allowing them space to continue, and watched as the lessons took root. Their confidence, their focus, their willingness to anticipate challenges, all reflected his quiet influence. For the first time, he understood fully that his impact was not limited to a single contest or moment. It was ongoing, persistent, and growing stronger with every day. That evening, he returned to his office, sitting at his desk with the familiar comfort of papers, ledgers, and quiet routine. Outside, the base settled into evening rhythm, soldiers winding down, conversations fading, lights flickering across the barracks. Yet Thomas felt the subtle hum of change all around him. The base had grown, evolved, and shifted not because of one man's dominance, but because one quiet individual had chosen to stand with focus, courage, and discipline. He opened a ledger, pen in hand, and reflected on the path that had brought him here. Victory over Sergeant Cole had been a pivotal moment, but it was only a beginning. The greater impact was the ripple it created, the encouragement, the inspiration, and the quiet transformation of a culture that had long valued only brute strength. Leadership, he realized, was not always about command. It was often about example, consistency, and the ability to inspire others to see potential in themselves. By the time Thomas closed the ledger and left the office, stars had begun to appear over the base. The night was calm, yet alive with subtle energy. Soldiers practiced, talked quietly, and moved with renewed confidence. Even in the darkness, Thomas could sense the lessons taking root, spreading through the ranks, shaping the future of the base in ways both quiet and profound. In that stillness, Thomas Avery understood a simple but enduring truth. True influence was not loud or flashy. It did not demand attention or recognition. It manifested quietly, in consistent action, in careful guidance, and in unwavering discipline. And when such influence takes hold, it transforms more than one person. It reshapes an entire community. And so, as Thomas walked through the base that night, observing the subtle changes, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He remained a clerk, a quiet presence behind the desk, but the ripples of his courage and wisdom extended far beyond his own life. In the hearts and minds of those he had touched, Thomas Avery had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of what could be achieved through preparation, focus, and quiet, steadfast courage. Months had passed since the legendary contest with Sergeant Cole. The base had settled into its routines, yet nothing was quite the same. Soldiers moved with a subtle confidence, their focus sharper, their decisions measured, and their respect for one another deeper. Where once strength and bravado ruled, now balance, strategy, and preparation had become just as important. Thomas Avery had become an invisible force behind this transformation, quietly shaping the culture of the base with his actions rather than words. Thomas walked through the yard one morning, observing soldiers as they moved through drills and exercises. The young recruits he had mentored were noticeably more confident, applying lessons learned in subtle but effective ways. Each step, each adjustment, reflected his quiet influence. He watched as a pair of soldiers discussed their approach to an obstacle course, mirroring the advice he had once given without even realizing it. They did not look to him directly, yet his teachings resonated through their actions. Even Sergeant Cole had adapted. Though still commanding and formidable, he now incorporated Thomas's philosophy into his training methods. He no longer relied solely on intimidation or brute strength. He emphasized discipline, observation, and strategy, subtly mentoring his soldiers in ways reminiscent of Thomas's approach. Their unspoken partnership had created a balance of power and wisdom that benefited the entire base. Cole's grudging respect for Thomas had deepened, and the two men shared an understanding born from the challenge they had faced together. In the supply office, Thomas continued his meticulous work, organizing ledgers and overseeing requisitions. Soldiers still sought his advice, and he offered it with patience and clarity. Every interaction, no matter how small, carried lessons of focus, preparation, and calm decision-making. Even routine tasks became opportunities for mentorship, demonstrating that discipline in everyday duties was just as vital as heroics on the training field. One afternoon, the general visited the base to observe a training session. He watched soldiers navigate obstacle courses, execute drills, and practice hand-to-hand techniques. His eyes lingered on Thomas, who remained quietly at his post in the office, observing without interfering. The general recognized the clerk's profound impact. While others sought recognition through force or ceremony, Thomas had changed the base with quiet consistency and unwavering discipline. His influence extended far beyond a single contest or moment. It had reshaped an entire culture. After the training session, the general approached Thomas in the office. "You've done more than I could have imagined," he said. "You've shown every soldier here that courage and skill are not always loud. Leadership is not always about command. Sometimes it's about example, patience, and quiet confidence. You've transformed this base." Thomas looked up, adjusting his glasses. "I haven't done it alone," he replied. "The soldiers and instructors have all contributed. I just hope they see that preparation, discipline, and self-trust can change outcomes." The general nodded, smiling. "Then you've succeeded beyond measure. Few people leave such a lasting mark quietly, without seeking attention. You've done that." The months that followed reinforced Thomas's legacy. Soldiers applied his lessons not just in training, but in everyday interactions. Mistakes were met with constructive guidance, not ridicule. Confidence grew in previously timid recruits, and veterans refined their approach to leadership, combining strength with strategy. Thomas's quiet mentorship had created a culture where preparation, observation, and deliberate action were valued alongside physical ability. Even beyond the training yard, his influence persisted. Requests for supplies and administrative tasks were now met with efficiency and strategic planning. Soldiers began to see the importance of careful thought in all aspects of military life. Thomas had proven that discipline and foresight were not confined to combat, they extended into every corner of the base, transforming both operational efficiency and morale. One evening, Thomas walked through the yard, observing soldiers practicing late drills. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the field. He paused to watch a young recruit attempt a difficult maneuver. The recruit stumbled, frustration evident in his expression. Thomas approached silently, guiding the soldier with subtle adjustments in stance and timing. The change was immediate. The young man executed the move successfully, grinning with pride. Around him, others watched in quiet admiration, absorbing the lesson without needing direct instruction. Thomas's influence had become self-sustaining. The soldiers he had mentored began teaching others, incorporating his philosophy into every aspect of their training. Leadership was no longer a product of rank alone. It was earned through example, patience, and mastery of one's abilities. Thomas had created a culture where quiet courage was as revered as bold action, and where every individual recognized the value of preparation and discipline. Even Sergeant Cole, once untouchable in his authority, had been humbled and transformed. He approached his duties with tempered intensity, incorporating subtle instruction and strategic guidance. His respect for Thomas was unspoken but profound, and his relationship with the clerk had evolved into a mutual understanding of strength, skill, and humility. Together, they represented a balance of power and wisdom that defined the base's new ethos. The soldiers themselves reflected this change. They moved with purpose, studied their environment carefully, and approached challenges with patience and thoughtfulness. The base, once defined by raw physical prowess, had become a place where strategy, focus, and discipline were equally celebrated. Stories of Thomas Avery's victory and mentorship were retold not as sensational tales, but as lessons in courage, preparation, and integrity. As night fell, Thomas returned to his office, closing ledgers and tidying supplies. The base settled into quiet routine, but he could sense the energy that persisted, the confidence, the determination, the subtle application of lessons learned. The ripple effect of his actions had extended far beyond single contest. He had become a symbol, not of showy heroics, but of the enduring power of quiet strength, discipline, and deliberate action. He reflected on the journey from the moment he had volunteered to face Sergeant Cole to the present. That choice, made without fanfare, had initiated a transformation far greater than he could have imagined. Courage had never been about recognition. It had been about trust in preparation, self-discipline, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. Thomas had embodied these principles, and the base had absorbed them, reshaping itself in subtle yet profound ways. The general's words echoed in his mind. The quietest voices carry the strongest lessons. Thomas realized now that his actions had indeed created a lasting impact. He had inspired courage, fostered discipline, and cultivated respect, all without seeking attention or accolades. His presence had become a guiding force, a benchmark for what leadership could look like when rooted in humility, preparation, and quiet confidence. As he finally left the office, stars dotted the sky above the base. Soldiers moved through the grounds, carrying the lessons they had learned, shaping the culture Thomas had quietly influenced. Even in the darkness, his impact was evident. Discipline, courage, and respect radiated through every interaction. The quiet clerk had become a cornerstone of the base, not through loud authority, but through consistent, deliberate action that inspired others to rise to their potential. Thomas walked alone, reflecting on the subtle but enduring changes he had witnessed. He had begun as a quiet observer, overlooked and underestimated. Yet through focus, preparation, and integrity, he had reshaped the base's culture, leaving a legacy that would persist far beyond his time there. Courage, he realized, was often silent. Leadership, often unseen. And influence, when applied wisely, could transform not just individuals, but an entire community. In that quiet night, Thomas Avery understood the full measure of his journey. He had not sought recognition, but he had earned something far more enduring: the respect, admiration, and trust of everyone around him. The base had been transformed by a single quiet presence, a testament to the power of discipline, courage, and steady leadership. And as he disappeared into the shadows of the quiet base, Thomas Avery's story became legend not for the spectacle of a single contest, but for the enduring lesson that even the quietest voices, when guided by preparation and integrity, could leave the strongest, most lasting echoes.